This is African American History is American History. Welcome. I'm your host, Harlan Kearsley. This program's goal is to foster understanding, promote discussion, and expand knowledge through stories of historical events, bios of unsung heroes, as well as timely and relevant news stories which hopefully will paint a vivid picture of the effects of segregation, discrimination, and bigotry on the lives of both blacks and whites. Comparisons will be made between the many racially fractured periods of American history and what's going on right now. Author, film director, and independent producer of more than 44 films, Oscar Micheaux is regarded as the first major African-American feature filmmaker. He was a prominent producer of race films. That's a genre of film produced here in America between roughly 1915 and the early 1950s. These films featured mostly black casts and were produced for black audiences. Michel has been described as, quote, the most successful African-American filmmaker of the first half of the 20th century, end quote. He produced both silent and sound films, and the Producers Guild of America called Oscar Micheaux, quote, the most prolific black, if not the most prolific independent filmmaker in American cinema, end quote. Oscar Micheaux's films were made during a time of great change in the African-American community. His films featured stories of contemporary black life. He dealt with racial relationships between blacks and whites and the challenges blacks faced while trying to achieve success in white society. Micheaux's films were used to oppose and discuss the racial injustice that African Americans received. Topics such as lynching, job discrimination, rape, mob violence, and economic exploitation depicted in his books and films as early as 1913 seem just as relevant today as they were back then.
It is only by presenting those portions of the race in my pictures in the light and background of their true state that we can raise our people to greater heights.
Born on January 2nd, 1884, near Metropolis, Illinois, Oscar Micheaux grew up in Great Bend, Kansas. He was one of 11 children of former slaves. As a young boy, Micheaux shined shoes and worked as a porter on the railway. As a young man, he very successfully homesteaded a farm in an all-white area of South Dakota. It was there that he began writing stories. Michel managed to overcome the attitudes and restrictions on black people at the time by forming his own publishing company. He sold his books door to door. With the advent of the motion picture industry, Michel saw it as a vehicle to tell his stories. So he formed his own movie production company. By 1919, Oscar Micheaux became the first African American to make a film. He wrote, directed, and produced the silent motion picture The Homesteader, starring stage actress and jazz blues singer Evelyn Preer. Preer became known within the black community as the First Lady of the Screen. She was the first black actress to become a celebrity. The Homesteader was based on Micheaux's novel of the same name. He used autobiographical elements in many of his stories. In Micheaux's 1925 film Body and Soul, he introduced the movie-going world to Paul Robeson, who had just come off his successful stage revival of the lead in The Emperor Jones in 1924. The Homesteader, Body and Soul, as well as many other films, reflected Micheaux's ideologies and autobiographical experiences. Micheaux's films countered the white portrayals of African Americans, which in those days tended to emphasize inferior stereotypes. He created complex characters of different classes. His films caused problems with the press and state censors because they often questioned the value system of both African American and white communities.
This is African American History is American History.
Within Our Gates was written, produced, and directed by Oscar Micheaux in 1919. It was preserved by the Library of Congress and named to its National Film Registry in 1992. This is the earliest known surviving film by an African American. To view the entire restored version of Within Our Gates, simply click on the link below. Within Our Gates is the story of Sylvia Landry, a fictional mixed-race schoolteacher. In a flashback, Sylvia is shown growing up as the adopted daughter of a sharecropper. When her father confronts their white landlord over money, a fight ensues. The landlord is shot by another white man, but Sylvia's adoptive father is accused and lynched with her adoptive mother. Sylvia is almost raped by the landowner's brother, but then discovers that he is her biological father. Michel always depicts African Americans as being serious and reaching for higher education. Before the flashback scene, we see that Sylvia travels to Boston, seeking funding for her school which serves black children who are underserved by the segregated society. On her journey, she is hit by the car of a rich white woman. Learning about Landry's cause, the woman decides to give her school $50,000. Now, in this film, as with a number of others, Michel depicts educated and professional people in black society as light-skinned, representing the elite status of some of the mixed-race people who comprised the majority of African Americans free before the Civil War. Poor people are represented as dark-skinned and with more undiluted African ancestry. Mixed-race people also feature as some of the villains.
My results might have been narrow at times, due perhaps to certain limited situations, which I endeavored to portray. But in those limited situations, the truth was the predominant characteristic. It is only by presenting those portions of the race portrayed in my pictures in the light and background of their true state that we can raise our people to greater heights. I am too imbued with the spirit of Booker T. Washington to engraft false virtues upon ourselves, to make ourselves that which we are not.
Within Our Gates is set within the Jim Crow era. Michel explored the suffering of African Americans in the present day without explaining how the situation arose in history. Some feared that this film would cause even more unrest within society, and others believed it would open the public's eyes to the unjust treatment of blacks by whites. Protests against the film continued until the day it was released. Because of its controversial status, Within Our Gates was banned from some theaters. Oscar Devereux Michel died of heart failure on March 25, 1951, in Charlotte, North Carolina. He is buried in Great Bend Cemetery in Great Bend, Kansas, the home of his youth. His gravestone simply reads, "A man ahead of his time." To learn more about Oscar Micheaux, you might be interested in the following books. Oscar Micheaux, The Great and Only, The Life of America's First Black Filmmaker, published in 2007 by Patrick McGilligan. And The Life and Work of Oscar Micheaux, Pioneer Black Author and Filmmaker, 1884 to 1951, by Earl James Young, Jr. This is also available as an audiobook. Plus, there are many more books on Oscar Micheaux, and they're available at your public library. This has been African American History is American History. The episode you've been listening to, Oscar Micheaux, a filmmaker ahead of his time, was written and directed by Harlan Kearsley. The voice actor for this episode, Robert McKay, as Oscar Micheaux. I'm Harlan Kearsley, and on behalf of everyone here at African American History is American History, thank you for listening. And if you haven't done so, please tap on the red subscribe button below. Once you do, you'll be notified as soon as new episodes are posted. Thanks again. African American History is American History. Copyright H.C. Kearsley, 2020.